My first guest this morning, I'm happy to say, is Sergei Karaganov, Russian foreign policy strategist, former senior advisor to both Vladimir Putin and, before that, his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. Good morning, Mr Karaganov.
Good morning.
It's good to speak to you. So let's start with a statement from our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who said the Russians are playing games with this ceasefire proposal. Are you playing games?
We are not playing games. We are negotiating the way out of this quagmire. However, I mean, we're catering mostly to our interests, not to the interests of Mr. Trump, or even more for his European or even worse, Ukrainian puppets.
Right.
We're catering to our interests.
And just to be clear what your interests are, you do not want to see an independent and sovereign Ukrainian nation state at the end of all this. Is that right?
We want to crush the will of European elites, which are, for the third time, I mean, because of their failures and desire to cover up their failures, pushing the world towards a world war. I mean, the third time in 100 years plus.
Right.
That is the main reason why we are fighting them. Second, we, of course, want to defeat these European elites, not European people, hopefully, if they are not thrown like cannon fodder as Ukrainians have been thrown. But on the road, we of course, to have to defeat this Ukrainian regime.
Right. So just to pick apart a few things that you said, that Russia wants to crush the will of the European nations in all this for the third time in a century. So are you blaming the Europeans for provoking a fight with Russia?
Yes, absolutely. Europeans have been the main driving force for pushing for NATO expansion. Americans are to be blamed too, but now they understood the price and they start to withdraw.
But it was Russia that invaded Ukraine.
I'm sorry, but we have been telling, me personally too, for 27 or more years, that if NATO expands towards the borders of Ukraine and close to Russia, by the way, against all promises, there will be war. The only thing I regret is that we waited for too long and we trusted our European neighbours for too long, or for these all kind of Minsk processes. We should have started earlier. Then probably there would have been less blood.
Right. But, I mean, the membership of Ukraine inside NATO has been taken off the table, certainly by the Americans, and the Europeans aren't resisting that. And even Ukraine itself seems to have acknowledged the fact that it will not be a member of NATO. So that doesn't satisfy you in any shape or form? That seems to be a major concession to Russia.
It is one. Europe, I mean, first of all, I mean, it is good that we have moved towards that point. However, of course, our European neighbors are not trusted because they have lied for too long. Second, there should be total demilitarization of Ukraine, no heavy weapons. Third, there should be denazification of Ukraine, and that is a change of this neo-Nazi regime, which they have installed with the help of the European sponsors.
Well, what you call the Nazi regime was democratically elected, which is more than one can say for governments in Russia.
Hitler was also democratically elected. Mussolini too.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, the point is that the Ukrainian people have paid for the invasion launched by your country with blood and treasure for the last 3 years. They are not going to give up willingly. They're not going to subject themselves to the will of Moscow, are they?
Germans who were intoxicated by Nazis were not also willing to subject to the will of Moscow. They subjected.
Okay, so where do you see this all ending then? I mean, let's start with a very specific measure of, the potential deployment of European peacekeepers on Ukrainian soil if there is a ceasefire to keep. Would you see that as a provocation?
First of all, I mean, no Europeans on anywhere. I mean, Europe should be pushed aside as far away from the central world politics. It has been the source of all troubles of the world for the last 500 years. Second,
So when you mean pushed aside, what are you talking about here?
Europe is the aggressor, is perpetrator of serial genocides during last several years. NATO, let me remind you, have raped Yugoslavia, 1999. Then most NATO countries invaded Iraq and devastated that land. Then in 12/11, there was another aggression against Libya. Now the Libya is still in shambles, and people are dying. So Europe should be pushed aside as far away as possible, or else you'd better change your elites who are driving your people as a cannon fodder towards another world war. But of course, I'm not trying to interfere into your internal affairs.
I mean, for the wars that you mentioned, and many of them were rather misguided wars of choice, I agree. But then, you have the Russian invasion of, you've got Chechnya, you've got Georgia, you've got a whole number of wars, obviously, and then Ukraine is the latest example, that was started by Moscow that, frankly, are seen as an expansion of Russian territory beyond its natural borders. So, I mean, where do we stand on that?
These were Chechnya was a rebellion supported, by the way, fully by the West and some of at that time the Arab friends, and it was a part of Russia. It was a secession movement. Georgia attacked South Ossetia and killed Russian peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers there, and was punished for that.
Right. What about the Baltic states? I mean, the Baltic states are very worried that Vladimir Putin will at some stage try some sort of incursion into them and test NATO's will regarding, the triggering of Chapter 5. Are the Baltic states something that, you think should be under, Russia's natural remit or not?
I've been telling to our Baltic neighbours, their leaders, that the best way for them to be secure, as well to other European leaders, is to have good relations with Russia instead of being belligerent. However, we do not need more land. We have more than a fantastic amount of land which we have to develop. We don't need to attack Europe, and nobody in Russia wants to do that. However, if one or two countries or some will pose a threat to our security, they will suffer.
And how would you define threat to your security?
Well, exactly like we defined Ukraine was militarized, was de facto engulfed by NATO. I mean, they were preparing for war. We simply, as we all know, and the whole Minsk agreements were, as it was acknowledged by European leaders, have been the cover up for preparation of war. So, I mean, if we have peaceful neighbors on our borders, fine. But of course, NATO is a kiss of death. Hopefully not.
Of course, the Ukrainians say they're merely defending their sovereign territory. They want to live peacefully inside their own borders and determine their own future and not leave that up to Moscow. That's what they were doing. They were not threatening Moscow or Russia in any way. They did not invade Russian soil. It was the other way around.
Europe and NATO was threatening Russia from the beginning to the end. We've been telling that stop, because of stupidity. And because of desire to take over new lands and new people as a cheap labor, NATO expanded.
Isn't that just completely paranoid?
Well, I'm sorry. I know history all too well.
Mhm.
We've been telling you 27 years when we were still friends. Don't move further, or else there will be war. I remember in 1913 I was talking to a group of European leaders, many of them, saying at that time it was to talk about involvement of Ukraine into the EU and then into NATO. I said, you're condemning Ukrainians for millions of deaths. They have condemned Ukrainians for millions of deaths. I really sympathize for Ukrainians who were fooled by their Western neighbors, not for the first time.
If Ukraine survives this process as an independent nation state, not inside NATO, that seems to have been ruled out, but inside the EU, what will Moscow's reaction be?
I don't think that we will be happy. Well, in principle, EU is becoming also an aggressive alliance, and it is becoming, taking into consideration what is happening in Brussels now, it looks more and more aggressive. But of course, it doesn't pose itself as a really hardcore security threat as a war. So I don't think that Europe will take devastated Ukraine into European unions or blah blah. However, I mean, let them do that. But first, as I've said, total demilitarization, no heavy weapons. Second, some proper areas of Russia are reunited with our country. Third, a demilitarized zone. No European troops. The European, by the way, recently Mr. Putin said that all foreign troops on the Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil will be not covered by the relevant international law. They will be treated as terrorists. So I would advise all people who are thinking of coming to Ukraine to be very careful, because they will not be protected by law. They will be not protected as prisoners of war.
Right. Well, that's quite a statement to say. Do you think that, sooner or later, I think Sir Keir Starmer has said Russia will have to come to the table to kind of negotiate some kind of ceasefire, because, of course, Russia itself, although you seem to be on a roll at the moment, don't want this war to continue forever. Do you see Russia coming to a table for a serious negotiations that does not involve some of the very extreme demands that you've just outlined?
We have been calling for serious negotiations from the beginning. Ukrainians and their supporters from the West have been blocking them. But they remind you that we have almost reached an agreement at the very beginning of the conflict. But then your former Prime Minister Johnson came and persuaded our poor Ukrainian neighbors to fight to the end, towards so the war continued with new vigor. So we are ready to negotiate, but we will cater to our interests and to the long-term interests of European security and world peace. And now we have to, for that, I believe personally, we have to defeat, at least morally, European elites which are mad, suicidal, and which are driving Europe and the world again into a third world war. Thanks God, I mean, our American former enemies, hopefully they will be partners again, have understood that they have to get out of this quagmire.
Right. So just finally then, on President Trump, do you see him at the moment more aligned with your interests or more aligned with Europe's interests?
I think that Mr. Trump, I do not know him all too well, is aligned with American interests. He understood that if America continues participation in this conflict, he will end either in a moral disaster like Afghanistan, or else they will see their nuclear strikes on the territory of the alliance and on the territory of the basis of the US in Europe.
Right.
He doesn't want that. I understand him all too well. So his Americans have started to withdraw. Even during President Biden, of course, when he was leaving, tried to provoke another round of war and push it the responsibility towards Trump and towards Putin. Both of them understood this trick all too well.
Briefly, you mentioned Afghanistan there. Of course, the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan all too hastily in 2021. But the Soviet Union had a disastrous experience in occupying Afghanistan. Do you really think that if you manage to have some hold over Ukraine, that you won't experience what you experienced in Afghanistan, but 10 times as bad? Because the Ukrainians, the ones that haven't been taken prisoner or killed by you, if they still have a pulse, almost to a man or a woman, they hate you and they will do everything they can to resist you.
Well, first of all, we do not want to take over all Ukraine. I mean, I have been. We didn't need that war. The problem was, of course, militarization of Ukraine and Nazification of this regime. I mean, Ukraine has been a huge burden on except for southern and eastern border areas, have been a burden on the shoulders of the Russian Federation in Soviet Union. Biggest burden. Thank you. Now, be our guests. First. Second, as to the population which will join us. Let me remind you that Germans were even more intoxicated by Nazism than Ukrainians. We eradicated them together with you.
I think we see the world rather differently. But Sergei Karaganov, thank you very much for joining us. I'm impressed, by the way, is that a bear that you shot on the bear skin hanging on the side of your wall behind you?
Today is Saturday, and I'm a hunter.
You're hunting. You seem to be in a hunting.
I'm not hunting. It's not a season.
Right. Okay. All right.
These are some of my trophies.
These are some of your trophies. Right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the program. Hunting season not yet in Moscow or outside Moscow, but it does seem to be in every other way. Well, that was interesting. We'll get your reaction to that on 0345 6060 973. What was interesting about it is that we seem to be seeing the world in very different ways. And maybe that's ultimately the biggest problem of any ceasefire negotiation that is taking place.